First of all, people were afraid. Okay, and fear, as we know, makes people think and act irrationally.
That is itself political. In other words, when you're living in a country, I mean, we've seen this historically in the past, but one of the ways the enemies of freedom work against freedom is often by instilling fear.
Absolutely.
Whether we're talking about the Reichstag fire, in the early years of the Nazis, but to use something to silence opponents, to instill fear. There's this threat, therefore we must all shut up and do X, Y, and Z. To some extent that happened with the approval of the Patriot Act under Bush. The idea that we've got to do this. We've got to throw out the rules because this is an unprecedented threat to everyone. That played into how
absolutely.
2020 went.
I think you're hitting on a couple things that are very important. One is that's why I say it was propaganda, okay? Because propaganda has a purpose. So it wasn't just that people were ignorant, incompetent, afraid. Speaking against, by the way, 15 years of known pandemic management, saying the lockdowns don't work and are harmful. This was known. It wasn't true that we learned that. It was known before spring of 2020. But the propaganda use was also to instill extra fear, like you're saying. And how do I mean that? They demonized people like me who were saying end the lockdowns by claiming they're dangerous. They're calling for let it rip. Let the infection spread with zero mitigation, survival of fittest, let whoever dies, dies. That was never said. That's not what I called in March of 2020 targeted protection, which was increasing the protection of people who had a significant risk to die.
Yeah.
And meantime, as we saw, people were dying in the nursing homes. This is a close population. So there was a very poor sheltering of the people who were at high risk, known to be high risk, and instead locking down schools and locking up playgrounds outside here in New York, getting in San Diego Coast Guard to go and get people out of their sailboats that were offshore because they were the dangerous
Look,
people.
This is clearly a kind of madness. There's just no question about it. Welcome to Socrates in the studio. It's my privilege right now to be talking to the incarcerated rapper Suge Knight. Gosh, I always get that wrong. I apologize. You're not Suge Knight. You're Scott Atlas, aren't you?
That's right.
Thank goodness, because the question that we are talking about today is really what is liberty? And I have wanted to talk to you about it because you seem, although you started life principally as a medical doctor, well, you professionally were a medical doctor teaching at the medical school at Stanford and so on and so forth, but you've taken a great interest in liberty to the extent that you've founded the Global Liberty Institute. So why don't we start, Scott Atlas, with, first of all, welcome. And let's start with who you are and how you found yourself being so concerned with liberty in our time, because there's a lot to cover.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me first.
Thanks for not being Suge Knight.
Well, that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
I would say my background is about 25 years of being a professor in academic medicine, doing clinical work, teaching, and doing research for half of my career at University of Pennsylvania after graduating from University of Chicago Medical School. And then the last half, or about 14 years, of being at Stanford University School of Medicine. About a decade ago, I full-time shifted into healthcare policy, quit the medical school because I thought it made sense for people who understand how healthcare is delivered, the value of tertiary care medicine, medical technology, to be at the table, not just dealing with spreadsheets of the economics of healthcare, but integrating all the information. So I've been working at Hoover Institution, which is a public policy institute at Stanford. And then early 2020 came, and news of this infection from China, this pandemic, emerged, say February 2020, while I was originally working on a book on healthcare system reform. And I began to notice that the narrative about the infection was what I called many, many times off the rails, because there was a total miscalculation of the risk, the infection fatality rate that was touted by the World Health Organization. And it's, to put it simply, it's a fraction. The bottom of the fraction is the number of people who have the infection. The top is the number of people who died. And they came up with this extraordinarily high, frighteningly high number, 3.4% infection fatality rate, which is makes everybody afraid. But then if you think about it for 10 minutes, if you know anything about medical science, you would realize they were only considering the people who were infected and sick enough to go see a doctor, whereas there's usually tens or orders of magnitude more people infected that should have been making that fraction much smaller. And so in March, I noticed that we were locking down everywhere, meaning shutting schools, closing businesses, taking people off of beaches and parks, forcing them indoors where, of course, these infections spread. So it made no sense. But we were also failing to notice that this infection, the pandemic of 2020, COVID was really only lethal to a very small group of people. The high-risk people were very old and basically frail with multiple comorbidities or underlying illnesses, whereas young people, children, had a minuscule, if any, risk of serious illness, children who were healthy. Yet this was not in the news, and the people everywhere, but particularly in the United States, were very afraid.
Now, I want to get to all of this, but so was this what pulled you in to thinking about liberty and freedom? And I say that because, you were for a long time a medical doctor teaching medicine. You said about 10 years ago you were brought into the Hoover Institution.
Right.
At what point in your life did these concepts begin to come into the foreground for you? Because most doctors are too busy doing medicine to be thinking about this kind of thing. Was this something that you grew up with?
Well, the breaking point for me was the fact that the lockdowns for the pandemic were the most imposing severe restriction that I had seen in my lifetime, and this was a shock that everything would close down and people would accept it. But the basic, and I think you're right, you're pointing out something very interesting to me, which is that most doctors are basically, if I can generalize, sort of a very traditional profession, conformist sort of thing.
Well, you would expect them to be agnostic on these issues, not to really, you don't expect them, to have a considered opinion on liberty or the founder's view of liberty. You just expect them to be professionals in that sphere. So I'm kind of wondering what.
Yes.
It sounds like before the pandemic, you were already thinking broadly if you're involved with the Hoover Institution from a decade ago.
That's right, because in public policy, you don't consider just the medical science or the data. You consider the whole sphere of influence of policy, and that, in this kind of case, means the consequences of the policies that weren't being considered, the economic disruption, the harms from severe economic downturns that literally kill people, the mandates, the edicts. There are impositions of freedom, particularly shocking given the country's founding on limited government and individual liberty.
Were you thinking about this before 2020? In other words, 10 years ago when you were at Hoover, you were already thinking about this stuff because you drifted into the world of public policy. You were no longer just doing medicine.
Right. Well, there's two parts to the answer. Number one, my entire career on public policy pre-pandemic was talking about the way that we get good health care to most people, which is not the government-imposed single-payer system, and that's a whole separate topic. So I was sort of oriented to that, but I would say that I think it goes back to individual, the way you were raised. Okay, I was raised explicitly to question authority. I'm not from the elite background of my peers at Stanford. I'm the first generation in my family to go to college. My grandparents weren't born in this country. They were immigrants. They had to learn how to speak English after they came.
Where did they come from?
Well, I had grandparents from Russia, London, France, and Poland. So I had 4 different grandparents, of course. They came at the turn of the century because it was the land of the free and the opportunity and escaping whatever they had. But these are people that had nothing but valued education. And it was instilled in me to not just question authority, but think for yourself. I mean, as a child, my opinion at our dinner table mattered. Not everyone's raised that way. I was not raised to sit still in the corner until you're spoken to. And I think that's part of my own personality that allowed me, and actually it was natural for me to question what was done, to be what I call a critical thinker. We can't just accept things that are told to us without thinking through them. And in fact, I think that's a very important thing that was exposed by the pandemic management in the era that we're in, which is that you're supposed to speak up. It's not just an opportunity to speak up when you live in a free society. It's an obligation because freedom disappears.
You're not familiar with me, but there's a lot that you've just said that there's some parallels because I was raised by European immigrants, and I think without realizing it, had an outsider's perspective on America and American freedom and a very negative view of authoritarian government since my parents had experience with them. And when you have that perspective, you're automatically different, whether you choose to be or don't, from most Americans who have been blessed with so much freedom, so much liberty over the decades that you forget that it is a thing. You think it is normal, and because you think it's normal, you are inured to possible threats. You don't really take them seriously, and that we'll get to that. But with the pandemic, I think that's what happened. That's part of the story, and you see this in other cultures and societies. But that when some people are, in a sense, prepared to question, and other times things have gone so well for so long that you forget that maybe at some point you have to say, "Excuse me, I think this is a mistake," or whatever. So that's just interesting to me.
Yes.
So your background when you were doing public policy at Hoover, a decade or so ago, were you thinking about these things? Were you speculating about these things before the pandemic?
Well, I was involved in the sense that being in healthcare policy, the big issue for many years was the imposition of mandates and government control over healthcare, as if single-payer centralized healthcare is better for people. When the data, because I'm very data-driven also, which was missing in the pandemic, the data showed that individual people not only should make choices for themselves, but are better at making choices because that sort of competition-based system makes quality go up and price come down in the narrow sense of healthcare reform. So the power of the individual was always, to me, one of the fundamental parts of how to derive, the better policy.
Okay, so you were already thinking about the free market, and you were thinking about the problem of government getting involved in healthcare as a threat to liberty, fundamentally, not just ideologically as a threat, but as a harm.
As a harm, to prevent the emergence of quality and actually choice itself for people, because there's nothing more personal in many ways than healthcare. This is not something simply, to me, it's antithetical to common sense that some external authority would tell you how to take care of your body. I think that's sort of the individualistic view of it, philosophical.
And it's, first of all, I agree with that. But what I'm interested in is that, you say an external, there are levels of externality, right? It's one thing for the state to mandate something. It's another thing for the country to mandate something. But what we're talking about, which I guess we'll get to, is where the U.S. government, to some extent, allowed non-American organizations, WHO and so on, a hand in determining policy for Americans. That to me is another kind of chilling level of how liberty is threatened. It's one thing to be threatened by a powerful state taking over large swaths of what used to be in the private sector, the medical establishment. It's another thing when you cede control, not just to the American federal government, but when the medical federal government cedes control to quote unquote international organizations. That was, to my mind, one of the stunning developments in the last few years.
And I think, and maybe we'll get to this, but we're on a pathway. The Biden administration has already said they support this new World Health Organization, quote, pandemic accord.
Right.
100%, even though it's not even been finally drafted. And in that accord, there are complete incursions into national sovereignty, such as the WHO defining when a public health emergency is occurring in your country.
This is so staggering. I mean, we need to get to this because the idea of our elected leaders in America ceding basically our sovereignty on this issue, on other issues, it's frankly mind-blowing to me because it's antithetical to the United States. In other words, it's not an interesting idea. It is fundamentally antithetical to our sovereignty, which should stagger people. People should be shocked, but somehow they're not. And so I want to talk about that. But I want to go backward to your, you're at Hoover. The pandemic happens, and you're invited in as an expert, a public health expert, to talk about this. So let's go there for a moment. In other words, you already had concerns before you were asked by the White House or whoever to opine on where we were.
I was writing and doing research because I saw, frankly, that even my own children, who I think are smarter than I am, although that doesn't mean more knowledgeable.
Or wiser, but
that's
maybe
right.
Smarter, okay.
But they didn't understand the basic thrust of what I was saying, that lockdowns were harmful, that locking down children was extraordinarily harmful and simply misguided policy. So I wrote and did research and became somewhat visible doing a lot of interviews over the spring, summer 2020. And then mid to late July, I was called up by the White House and asked, would you come and at least speak to the president? Which sounds to me like sort of a ridiculous question. I'm an American. It's my country. It's the biggest healthcare crisis in a century. And anyone who would say no to coming in and speaking to the President of the United States, I can't even fathom that. Although in our highly politicized, divisive sort of situation in this country, with a president who many people despise, that was considered a question.
Abraham Lincoln?
I'm talking about President Trump.
Oh.
So I said, of course I would come in. And I spent the day at the White House interviewing with all the people that you've heard of, President Trump, Vice President Pence, Jared Kushner, Mark Meadows, et cetera. And at the end of the day, Jared Kushner said, we would like you to help advise the president on the pandemic.
In what month of 2020?
This is in July, late July 2020.
So fairly well along into this already. In other words, we had already experienced dramatic lockdowns for months because we were all told, obviously, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. So this is well past that. I remember Trump rather hopefully saying, I think Easter would be a good time for us to end this, that would be, and I think a lot of Americans were tracking and thinking, yeah, we've had enough of this. But we were only at the beginning of it at that point.
We were only at the beginning. And so, yes, the task force, the White House Coronavirus Task Force, which was the official sort of policy body of the federal government, was already in place for 6 months, for about 5 months by the time I got there. And I remember, I first, my reaction was, well, of course I'll help, but I just want to make sure you know what you're going to get. I'm not going to sign on to something that I don't agree with. I'm not going to change my mind just because the president or anyone tells me to. And they said, well, that's exactly why we want you. So I said, okay, that's great. But then the next sentence that Jared Kushner said was, but they're going to destroy you once it becomes public. And so I said, okay, I'm a neophyte. I'm not a political person at all. And I said, well, that doesn't sound so good to me. And so I said, I'll go back to California and we'll see how it works from there. And so I went back to California and for a few days tried to advise, but things were sort of chaotic and a lot of total misinformation was being fed to the president. And so I came back and he was right that the media went ballistic.
Now, most people are familiar with this dynamic, but it's still horrifying. It's horrifying afresh every time I think of it, that things could be so politicized that it would affect fundamental questions of health. So we have two issues here. First of all, you had perspective, wisdom, experience as a medical doctor, that how we were dealing with things, the lockdowns, the masks, was bad from a health perspective first. So that's one piece. The second piece was that to talk about that somehow early on became politicized, because we always wonder, how did these things happen? That's a horrifying development in American history, that when you're talking about nuts and bolts, black and white, 1 + 1 is 2, that would be politicized, that your position on lockdowns, a medical perspective, a medical opinion would be politicized, that you would be demonized for having a genuinely considered opinion on medical things.
Right. And the question, of course, is, how did that all happen? One, as you're pointing out, I think in the beginning it was political. Of course, it ended up being all over the world, and not everything is about Trump and hatred for Trump, so it can't be just that. But there were two things that happened, I think. Number one, you were demonized by people saying, if you're ending the lockdowns, you're choosing the economy over lives. Okay, and that would be, of course, a heinous decision to make. But that's actually contrary to decades of economics literature, which shows that severe lockdowns
ironically, yeah. So that's kind of extraordinary. But even that is a politicization of. We're talking about many different things, but it is interesting, at least to me, how political this got so quickly.
Immediately. And I think part of this, like I say, when President Trump said he was early on saying, now wait a second, this doesn't make sense to close down the economy and schools. That's not a good thing. And he was saying things, without data, but with common sense, I think. And that was viewed in an election season, with the beginning of a presidential campaign season, as, okay, that must be, this is my opinion, that must be, no, that's wrong by the political opponents. It's similar to when he said, very prematurely, hydroxychloroquine works, you should take hydroxychloroquine. And so the immediate reaction was, no, that's a very dangerous drug, even though hydroxychloroquine is not a dangerous drug. Whether it works on COVID wasn't known at that time, but the trials should have been done. But they weren't done. People were frightened of hydroxychloroquine because, in my view, because President Trump said use hydroxychloroquine. So this was, in fact, one of the things I said to him when I first met him, going into the White House in that interview, or not interview, but just discussion. The first, one of the early things I said was, you should have said hydroxychloroquine does not work.
I was just going to say, if you want to play 5D chess,
right,
that's the thing to say.
And, he, of course, got that joke right away. Yeah. And so it was very political, but it was more than that. There were some things going on that were in addition to that. I don't think it's fair to say it was all political. First of all, people were afraid. Okay, and fear, as we know, makes people think and act irrationally.
That is itself political. In other words, when you're living in a country, I mean, we've seen this historically in the past, but one of the ways the enemies of freedom work against freedom is often by instilling fear.
Absolutely.
Whether we're talking about the Reichstag fire, in the early years of the Nazis, but to use something to silence opponents, to instill fear. There's this threat, therefore we must all shut up and do X, Y, and Z. To some extent that happened with the approval of the Patriot Act under Bush. The idea that we've got to do this. We've got to throw out the rules because this is an unprecedented threat to everyone. That played into how
Oh, absolutely. And
2020 went.
I think you're hitting on a couple things that are very important. One is that's why I say it was propaganda, okay? Because propaganda has a purpose. So it wasn't just that people were ignorant, incompetent, afraid. Speaking against, by the way, 15 years of known pandemic management, saying the lockdowns don't work and are harmful. This was known. It wasn't true that we learned that. It was known before spring of 2020. But the propaganda use was also to instill extra fear, like you're saying. And how do I mean that? They demonized people like me who were saying end the lockdowns by claiming they're dangerous. They're calling for let it rip. Let the infection spread with zero mitigation, survival of the fittest, let whoever dies, dies. That was never said. That's not what I called in March of 2020 targeted protection, which was increasing the protection of people who had a significant risk to die.
Yeah.
And meantime, as we saw, people were dying in the nursing homes. This is a close population. So there was a very poor sheltering of the people who were at high risk, known to be high risk, and instead locking down schools and locking up playgrounds outside here in New York, getting in San Diego Coast Guard to go and get people out of their sailboats that were offshore because they were the dangerous
Look,
people.
this is clearly a kind of madness. There's just no question about it. When you're doing things like that, when you're arresting people in a park, that seems patently to be madness. So the question is, who was pushing this larger narrative?